who had given up power to retire in peace. Clearly, there is no putting a box around Sulla. He remains a singular figure in world history. He died in 78 BC, and his gravestone was marked by an epitaph he wrote himself, summing up his life, as well as anything anybody else could possibly say would. No greater friend, no worse enemy. Seems to say it all. Sulla saw himself as a champion of the old order, and believed that he had left Rome with the institutional tools it needed to prolong the Republic indefinitely. The Senate was back in charge, the populist demagogues were silenced, and ambitious men were no longer able to circumvent the traditional path of power, nor remain in power past their single year in office. But of course, all the revised statutes in the world could not distract from the very fact of his life and career. The last vestiges of the old Republican virtue had been stripped away by his dictatorship, and all that remained was naked power, to be acquired by any means necessary. Most of Sulla's constitutional reforms would be repealed within a decade of his death, and within 3 decades, Rome would be engulfed in a war between the men who looked at Sulla's career and asked themselves, as Pompey did, if Sulla could, why not me? Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 35, Crassus and Pompey. In 78 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla died, believing that he had put the Republic back on track. Since the end of the Third Punic War 80 years previously, Roman politics had skewed more and more towards populist demagogues, blatant corruption, and a flouting of traditional virtue. Sulla, in his role as dictator, had gutted the power of the tribunes and put the Senate firmly back in control of state affairs. It is ironic that the supposed savior of republicanism had so completely eschewed democratic principles and the rule of law, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Besides, Sulla could always fall back on one of the first offenses a child ever learns to justify all of his extra-legal activities. Marius started it. But as I said at the end of last week's episode, no amount of constitutional reformation could divert the gaze of ambitious men from the facts of Sulla's life and the power he had won through brute force alone. Whatever had bound the leaders of Rome to the traditional republican governing apparatus and its built-in limits on absolute power had been shattered. The Gracchi had struck the first blow when they successfully introduced violence into the political arena. Marius hammered the point home when he brazenly stood for consulship after consulship, while Sulla himself landed the killing stroke when he had himself appointed dictator for life. The era of noble adherence to the rule of law was dead. The era of the naked power grab was at hand. Whatever great work Sulla accomplished in his life, saving the Republic was certainly not among them. Indeed, the generation that would kill the Republic grew up in the shadow of Sulla's dictatorship, and the ringleaders of its demise were some of Sulla's leading supporters. 2 of those supporters, Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius, would eventually forge an uneasy alliance with an up-and-coming popularity general named Julius Caesar to form the First Triumvirate, the vehicle through which the Republic met its demise. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born in 115 BC, making him 33 years old during the Battle of the Colline Gate, and the eldest of the 3 triumvirs. Crassus was the youngest of 3 boys, born into a well-bred Publian family, and was descended from Publius Licinius Crassus, who, in addition to serving as Pontifex Maximus for nearly 20 years during the Second Punic War, also held the distinction of being Scipio Africanus' co-consul in the year 205 BC, as the great general made his preparations to win that long war once and for all. Their father had been consul in 97 BC, governor of southern Spain from 97 to 93 BC, and censor in 89. The Crassus family was wealthy and well-respected, but eventually ran afoul of the Marians during the upheavals of the mid-80s BC. Though they had supported Marius in the past, they attempted to hew a more neutral line in the struggle between the old general and his younger rival, and were marked for purging. One of Crassus's brothers had already been killed in the Social War, but his father and remaining brother were caught up in the purges and were either murdered or committed suicide. Only Marcus escaped to carry on the family name, fleeing to Spain in 87 BC. In Spain, Crassus was able to hook up with clients his father had established while governor, and laid low while Cinna controlled Rome. It went without saying that when news of Sulla's return from the east reached him, Crassus immediately declared his support and left Spain, intent on helping Sulla drive the Marians out of Rome. He raised a small force and arrived in Italy around the same time as Metellus Pius had arrived with his army from Africa. Crassus fought alongside Metellus until they all merged into Sulla's army prior to the Battle of the Colline Gate. And it was in that battle that Marcus Licinius Crassus became a man in his own right and was no longer seen as simply his father's son. With Sulla leading the left side of the line, he gave Crassus command of the right. And as it turned out, Sulla found himself evenly matched and unable to break through the Samnite line. But Crassus routed his opposition and was able to wheel in and trap the remaining Samnites, winning for Sulla not just the battle, but complete control of Rome. He expected to be amply rewarded and praised for his early support and critical role in Sulla's victory, but in the first chapter of what turned out to be the defining story of his life, Crassus was overshadowed by the younger and more charismatic Pompey. Though mildly embittered by his perceived snubbing, Crassus had far more important things to worry about than why young Pompey had been granted a triumph, despite having never held a single office in the cursus honorum. I mean, he had never even been a quaestor, let alone a praetor, which was supposedly the minimum rank required for a triumph. And besides, he was what, 25? He couldn't stand for a praetorship even if he wanted to. But like I say, I don't care. I'm fine with it. I'm happy for him. Hooray for Pompey. Pompey the Great. Yeah, sure. Crassus didn't care at all. But instead of dwelling on Pompey, there would be plenty of time for that later. Crassus focused on rebuilding the family fortune, which had been expropriated by the Marians after his father's death. In this pursuit, Crassus showed both above-board shrewd financial acumen, as well as a penchant for ruthless, below-the-belt profiteering. He gleefully entered the chaotic economic mess that arose from the Sullan Reign of Terror. Having been a victim of the Marian purges, Crassus had little sympathy for the men who had killed his father and brother. Crassus was first in line to buy up whatever the proscribed left behind when they either fled the city or were murdered, and on at least one occasion, he added a name to the list simply because he coveted the holdings of an otherwise politically neutral rival. During Sulla's reign, Crassus bought and sold his way to the top of Rome's financial food chain, and after the dictator's death, he invested his profits in the slave trade and silver mines, where he doubled and then quadrupled his money. Man and largest landowner. He never lost his lust for wealth nor his cunning skill at acquiring it. For example, at the time, Rome had no formal firefighting service, so when Crassus learned through his citywide network of clients and informants that a building was on fire, he would arrive on the scene with hundreds of slaves in tow. With the house burning in front of them, Crassus would offer to put the fire out if the distraught owner agreed to sell the property. In these circumstances, Crassus was able, of course, to extract a ridiculously low price, at which point the slaves would indeed quell the blaze. Sometimes, though, the owner would refuse to sell, in which case Crassus would leave with his firefighters, allowing the house to be engulfed in flames. But these were the rare cases. Usually the owner sold, Crassus bought, and his private empire grew by another block. At the height of his power, Crassus is estimated to have been worth between 170 and 180 billion 2008 dollars. To put that in perspective, the richest man in the world today is Warren Buffett, who is estimated to have a personal financial net worth of around 66 billion US. To say that Crassus was absolutely filthy, stinking rich is an understatement. But he always carried with him something of an inferiority complex. In Roman culture, wealth may have been looked upon with envy, but rarely with respect or admiration. Respect and admiration were reserved for military heroes. His exploits during the Battle of the Colline Gate were always looked at sideways, as they came during a civil war and were achieved at the expense of fellow Roman citizens. If Crassus wanted to join the pantheon of great Romans, he would have to do better to win new territory for Rome or defend the empire from a dangerous foreign threat. Crassus spent his entire life looking for an opportunity to lead an army in the field, win a great victory for Rome, a triumph for himself, and the respect he felt he deserved. Eventually, this obsession would lead to his death in Syria, where he was killed still trying to find what he was looking for. On the battlefield, Crassus was simply unable to match the exploits of his contemporary rival and nominal ally Pompey, who, much to Crassus's eternal bitterness, seemed to live a perpetually charmed life. From Crassus's perspective, no one got better press for doing less than Pompey, but there was nothing that he could do about it. So Crassus went through life known as Crassus Dives, or Crassus the Rich, whereas Pompey went through life known as Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great. And though the latter's nickname was originally thrown around as a sarcastic dig by his elders, Pompey eventually promoted the name as a literal title, and the people of Rome embraced it as such, much to Crassus's eternal dismay. Pompey was born in 106 BC, making him 9 years younger than Crassus, and only 24 years old when Sulla won control of Rome. He was the son of the not-so-beloved Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, or Pompey the Cross-Eyed. Pompey Strabo was the first in his family to achieve senatorial status, and distinguished himself during the Social War, leading the victorious Roman armies in the north as consul in 89 BC. However, when you emerge from a war with the nickname the Butcher of anything, you know that your tactics have been a bit harsh. So when Pompey Strabo, aka the Butcher of Asculum, died in 87 BC of the plague, his body was dragged through the streets by a joyously disrespectful mob. Not exactly the funeral procession one hopes for. But the sins of the father do not seem to have rubbed off on the son, and when Sulla returned from the east, Pompey raised 3 legions from the ranks of his father's veterans. The young man had served with them since his first campaign at the age of 17, so his father's soldiers loved and trusted the boy who had grown up in the barracks as one of their own. After helping pacify northern Italy, Pompey was next given the task of ensuring the loyalty of Sicily, which was still teeming with Marians. As I've mentioned numerous times, Sicily was the breadbasket of Rome, and controlling it was essential to controlling the empire. As long as Rome remained fed, the people were generally content to allow themselves to be led by whoever wanted the job. But if those grain shipments ever stopped, anarchy, as they say, was only 3 missed meals away. If the Marians controlled Sicily, they could wreak havoc on Sulla's attempt to consolidate power. Pompey threw himself into the task with a ruthlessness that reminded some of his father. He tracked down Papirius Carbo, the consul who had fled from Etruria at the end of the Civil War, and had him executed. When the people of Sicily complained that some of Pompey's men